Hello my beautiful friends, welcome back to my channel. It is so good to have you back here again for another episode. And if you are new here, hello and welcome. Why don't you stick around to see what kind of shocking but very interesting true crime story I have for you today. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now before I go on with the case, I have to give out a content warning that in this case I will be talking about grievous bodily harm, sexual assault, as well as violence. So if you are sensitive to that kind of content, then viewer discretion is very much advised. Now I know that last week I didn't upload an episode. Truth of the matter is I was very exhausted, guys. As much as I love making true crime content for you guys, trust me, this thing is a lot of work. So I had to take a bit of a breather, but I am back and boy, do I have a crazy one for you today. So let's just get on with it. We're going to talk about the case of Santa Pretorius, who was brutally murdered by her 16-year-old daughter and her 18-year-old boyfriend a few years ago in 2002. And trust me, this is not going to be a story you are going to believe. A couple of years earlier from that, Santa was a young woman in her 20s who had a dream of having a family that would grow stronger and closer only as time went on. And it was also in her early 20s when she met the man who would become her husband. And this seemed like her dream was very close to coming true. However, at the age of 24, when Santa and her husband were expecting their first child, Natasha, that is when Santa realized that her husband had a very big problem with alcohol consumption. And of course, as we all know, with any case of alcohol abuse, this affected their way of living because Santa's husband couldn't just keep any of his jobs. So they also had to keep moving around because they were struggling financially. And the standard of living was so bad that their daughter Natasha had to be taken away from them and put in a foster care home. And as much as this greatly affected Santa, she still hoped that at one point her family would find some sort of stability. So she stayed with her husband, hoping that at one point their daughter would be returned back to them once they achieved whatever form of stability she wanted to achieve. But sadly that never happened. They never got their daughter Natasha back. So she was always in foster care. Then at the age of 31, Santa and her husband were expecting their second daughter, whom they named Alta. And even though there still wasn't much stability in the family, even when Alta was born, this didn't really affect Alta that much because she was excelling in school, and even in spite of the fact that they had to change places in 10 years, Alta had to go to different schools in a span of 10 years. So that never affected her academics. She was a very smart girl and she did quite well for herself. And even when her father had his own violent behaviors because of his alcohol abuse, that didn't affect the relationship that Alta and her father had because they were still very close. But sadly, in 1997, Alta's father lost his life when he committed suicide because of his alcoholism and his depression. And of course, this devastated Alta because, again, she was very close to her father in spite of everything that he went through because of his alcohol abuse. And because now her father died, she started blaming her mom for the loss of her father, saying that the constant nagging and complaining that her mother did all the time is what drove her father to committing suicide. We don't know how true that is. That is just the claims that came from Alta after her father died. So as time went on, Alta became very distant and very overtaken by the grief of losing her father, so much so that she ended up being mixed up with the wrong crowds, the wrong kind of kids in the neighborhood, and she started even smoking some marijuana with these new friends of hers. And when Santa found out what her daughter had been doing, of course, she was very shocked because remember, Alta grew up as a very good girl, a girl who was doing well in school, a girl who was behaving well, just up until her father died. So this came as a very big shock to her mother. So when Santa found out about this, she confronted Alta about it, about her new friends, about her new habit of smoking marijuana. And when she tried to talk to her about it, this is when Alta claimed that her mother started threatening her by saying that she would send her into foster care to go be with her sister if she didn't behave. Now again, I don't know how true that is. We don't know how true that is because these are Alta's claims, but she says her mom started threatening her, saying that she would send her into foster care if she didn't behave. So then after this, Santa and Alta moved to Pretoria, and Santa was hoping that this new change of the environment would somehow get her daughter to behave a lot better and would somehow get things to be a lot better in the house. And for a while, they actually were really good in the house. Alta started attending a new school in Pretoria West, and her mother started working as a nurse in a hospital in Pretoria. But of course, as you already know, nurses work long hours, and her mother needed these hours so she can be able to make ends meet, since she was now a single mother with a daughter depending on her. So this meant that Alta was alone most of the time at home. Whenever she came back from school, she would always be alone, and they never really got to spend a lot of time together because her mom was working long hours. At this new school in Pretoria West, Alta met a 17-year-old boy, and they started hanging out together. And this boy's name is Jaco Steyn. And these two thought that they had something in common. They started bonding over some thoughts of how they are neglected by their families, and so because of that, they really hit things off. They started getting interested in each other and they started dating. Jaco had 2 other siblings, but his parents went their separate ways when he was just 3 years old. So because of this, his mother had to work 2 jobs to be able to take care of him and his siblings. And so you can imagine that this means that his mother didn't have much time on her hands. And Jaco said that this made him feel like his parents didn't have much time for him, and that's why he started getting involved in criminal activities and mischievous behaviors only at the age of 8. And it was all just to get some attention. In his 2nd grade, he stole some money, and because of this, he was put in a school for children with behavior issues. And at this point, his mom had actually met a new man and was married to this guy. And even though there could be some form of stability now that there's 2 parents in the family, things didn't get better for Jaco. He was still involved in a lot of mischievous activities. So much so that in his 3rd grade, he stole another kid's bike in the neighborhood. And then in his 4th grade, he was caught shoplifting. So yeah, it was very much too late for him at this point. Even though there were 2 parents in his house, it just seemed like he just continued being a problematic child. And even before he got into high school, he started using drugs such as LSD, ecstasy, and heroin. And you and I both know that in most cases like this, that never goes well. He ended up being expelled from the school that he was in Pretoria due to his aggressive behavior when he was only in the 9th grade. After this, he was sent to a boarding school, which he also got expelled from because of being in possession of illegal substances. Then after being expelled from the boarding school, he went to go live with his father and his stepmother. And then his father put him in another school, but of course it wasn't long before he got expelled from that school as well. After this, he really got into using a lot of heroin. And this is when he got into the school where he met Alta. So after Jaco and Alta met, like I said, they got very close, they started dating, and of course, they started doing drugs together. And then at some point, they had this genius idea to run away from their families, but they were caught very soon after that, attempting to run away from their families' homes. And when it was found out that they were addicted to drugs, they were taken into a youth center for some assessment. And after their assessments, it was concluded that both these kids should be put in rehab, but they were put in different rehabilitation centers. But you see, the kind of rehab center that Jaco was put in was also used as a juvenile detention center for kids who were awaiting their trials. And this meant that he was in there with some of the worst kids you could ever think of. And of course, this was not going to end well, because if you put someone with his kind of behavioral issues next to kids who are in a detention center awaiting their trials, that is a very bad mix. Didn't really look like things were going to get better for him. Alta, on the other hand, was regularly visited by her mother, and it seemed like they were working on rebuilding their relationship. And it was going so well that Alta wrote in her diary that she was very grateful that her mom is supporting her in all of this, that she's there by her side and she's not alone. So it really seemed like things were getting back on track, like they were going to be, good again. So you might ask yourself, what actually went wrong? Why are we here talking about this case? Well, you're about to find out. Alta was released from rehab in June of 2001. And when she was released, her mother thought that it was time for a new change, a new beginning. So they moved to a new flat at the Ontario building in Gazina. And Santa hoped that when her daughter got back to school on the next month in July, everything would go back to normal and her daughter would be back on track and she would be on her way to, succeeding in her academics. And of course, she went back to school the next month in July. But at one point, she came back to tell her mother that Jaco was also released from rehab and they were getting back together. And of course, this was not good news to her mother, and she tried as best as she could to advise her daughter to not get back with this guy, to let him go and forget about him. But her daughter simply just told her that they were in love and nothing was going to get between them. Teenagers, you just cannot tell them anything. They think they know everything and anything about everything. So as they kept on going back and forth about how Alta and Jaco should break up, Santa ended up thinking to herself, you know what, the more I keep arguing with this kid about this boy, the more I'm going to push her away and we'll be back to square one. So she ended up relenting. She ended up giving up from trying to separate these kids. Because again, when it comes to teenagers, you cannot tell them anything. So she ended up giving up and stopped attempting to break up these kids. On July 6th in 2001, Santa visited her sister, and she was there, of course, to vent about these kids and their messed up relationship. And get this, it turns out that when Alta realized that Jaco was released from rehab, he told her that he didn't want to go to live with his family again. So Alta was asking her mother to please let him come and live with them. And of course, they argued about this because Santa was not about to have that. So she refused until her daughter gave up. But as she was talking to her sister, it turns out that the kid was always there so much that it might as well have looked like he was living with them. So of course, now the house was becoming very problematic for Santa. She didn't feel very comfortable in her own home. Because another complaint that she had about the kid was that she thinks that he's bringing drugs into the house. And of course, that wouldn't be far-fetched, seeing as how he had a past of using different types of drugs. So she was really concerned about this kid. And when she was done talking to her sister, she left, and that was the last time she would be seen alive. On the next day, on July 7th in 2001, Alta and Jaco were high on heroin, and Santa could tell that her daughter was now addicted to drugs. So she got very angry about this and she confronted Alta about it. She told her that her boyfriend was no longer allowed at that house and Alta will only get to see him on Fridays. Of course, the teenager was very, very pissed about this, but she ended up giving up after the fight that they had, and she said she understands and she's not going to fight her mother about it and she will do as she said. And then later on that night, they were all sitting in the living room watching TV, and then Santa fell asleep. So when these kids saw that she was asleep, they snuck out and went into the kitchen where they started having some sex. But Santa was woken up by the noise that was coming from the kitchen, and she ended up telling the kids to come back into the living room and sit still. And when they got back, they kept watching some more TV, and at this time it was very late. So now Santa really fell asleep. She got knocked out and she was deeply asleep. And as she was sleeping, the two kids realized something. They realized that as long as Santa was still alive, as long as she was around, they would never get to do whatever they wanted whenever they wanted to do it. So this is when one of them had the bright idea of ending her life. So at 2 a.m. on the 8th of July, that's when the two kids decided to take the life of Santa Pretorius. Some sources say that it was Alta who brought up the idea to Jaco, and others say that it was Jaco who brought up the idea to Alta. But as soon as the idea was on the table, Alta just quickly went to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, and she gave it to her boyfriend so he could do the stabbing. And just a few seconds after handing him the knife, Jaco started stabbing Santa so brutally, so viciously, that she woke up in pain, screaming and asking him to stop. And then her daughter went back in the kitchen and grabbed another knife and came back to join her boyfriend in stabbing her own mother. Before Santa finally stopped moving, she was stabbed 20 times in her hips, her chest, her face, as well as her neck. 20 times. by these two kids. And just to make sure that she was really dead, because they didn't think she was dead at this point, Jaco took out his shoelace and he strangled her with it, just to make sure that the job was really done. Once they were done killing Santa Pretorius, they decided to chill on the couch soaked in blood. And they got high and they had some coffee. And then after that, they decided to take a walk and acted as if like nothing had just happened. And when they got back, they just went to the fridge and took out some jelly, and they ate the jelly and then went to bed because they were exhausted from all the killing that they had just done. So when these kids woke up the next day, they realized that they had a dead body that they had to deal with on their hands. So now they started thinking of ways they could try to get rid of it. And this is when Jaco had this bright idea that if they could cut the body into small enough pieces, they could somehow flush it down the toilet. I don't know if that would work, but okay. So he went back to his house and got some butcher knives as well as a saw. And when he came back, they tried to cut the body, but they realized that it wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. And they ended up being lazy, too lazy to finish the job, so much so that they decided, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. We're just going to try to find another way, because cutting up Santa's body was just too much work for them. And Alta knew that her uncle was supposed to come over that day for lunch, and he was going to be there any moment. And of course, they could not allow him to see what they had done. So they started covering the bloody furniture of the house with some blankets, and they took Santa's body, they wrapped it up, and they hid it behind the couch where no one would be able to see it. And then later on that day at night, the two kids decided to go to Sunnyside to get high and to try to forget about their problems. Like they didn't have a dead body that was decomposing back at the flat, so they wanted to get high and they didn't want to go back, and they spent the night in Sunnyside. So Santa was killed over the weekend. And on Monday, when she didn't show up for work, her boss was of course concerned, because Santa was not the kind of person to miss her shifts. Because if you remember well enough, Santa needed the money so she can be able to take care of her daughter. So when she didn't show up for work, her boss called her older daughter Natasha and told her that her mom didn't come in for work. Natasha was about 24 years old at this time. Natasha ended up calling her mother's sister, and she asked her if she had seen her anywhere. And her mother's sister told her that the last time she saw her was on the 6th of July when she came over to talk to her. And she had never seen her since. So both of them got very worried about this. So they went to the flat to try to check out on Santa and see if everything is okay. But when they got there, they realized that the place was locked up and no one was answering the door when they were knocking. So they saw the caretaker outside and they were asking the caretaker to please open up for them. But of course, the caretaker told them that opening up the flat without Santa's permission would be an invasion of her privacy. So if they really wanted to get in that badly, they would have to come with the police. So Natasha did call the police and she reported her mother as a missing person. But the police told her that since Santa is an adult, a grown woman, she could have left on her own choice without even telling anyone. So they were not going to take the case as that much of a priority. So yeah, that's what happened when she called the police. And then later on that day, Alta and Jaco got back to the flat. But when they got back, they decided that they didn't want to have to deal with the sight of Santa's body on the floor. So they decided to get in through another way, and also they took the microwave from the kitchen and they put it in Alta's room so they can warm up some food, get high, and then fall asleep again. Mind you, there is still a body decomposing in that house, but they were acting like it is not there. So then the next day, on Tuesday, when Santa didn't show up for work again, her boss still called Natasha to tell her that her mom was nowhere to be seen. So again, Natasha called the flat to try to see if she could maybe talk to her. And this is when Alta picked up the phone and told her big sister that their mother had left on Sunday with a man in a red car and she hadn't seen her since, which of course was a lie. And at this time, Alta and Jaco were starting to get stressed out about this because, like I said, Santa's body was decomposing in that flat. And they realized that if the smell got any stronger, people would start asking questions. So then they had this idea to run away. But first, before they did that, they decided to go to the house of one of Jaco's friends so he could steal the gun and bullets that they had in that house. And when they got there, they did exactly that. Alta had to distract Jaco's friend while Jaco snooped around their house and also stole the gun and the bullets. And after this, they went back to the flat, and when they got back there, they tried to get in, and that's when the caretaker saw them. He called Natasha to tell her what's happening. And this is when Natasha notified the police. But the police only went over to the flat to check things out on Thursday. But when they got there, as soon as they opened the door, they were just taken aback by the smell of the decomposing body that was left in that house. And of course, being as experienced as they were, they knew that that is the smell of a decomposing body. And as they looked around, they found Santa's body exactly where it was hid after she was killed, behind the couch. And the place was a mess, and Santa's body was found half naked. And the cops also found some marijuana in the house. They found a bloody coffee mug and also a broken knife and some other bloody knives, as well as half-eaten plates of food. And by the looks of all of that, it seemed to them that the killer or killers may have lived in that house even after they killed Santa Pretorius. Natasha was called over to come and identify her mother's body, and as the police kept on looking around, they found Alta's diary. And in the diary, she wrote about how she was waiting for her uncle to come so they can both admit to what they had done. But of course, as the police were looking around the crime scene trying to investigate what happened, the two kids were already gone. They were hitchhiking trying to get to a friend's place in Kempton Park. And as they were waiting in Pretoria, a man by the name of William stopped and gave them a ride. They got in the car and Alta got in the front seat and Jaco was in the back seat. But just after a few minutes of driving, Jaco pulled out the gun and he put it up against the neck of William. And he started demanding that William give up his wallet and also that he stops the car. But when William wasn't stopping the car because he was too busy begging for his life, Alta pulled the handbrake and the car came to a complete stop. And when the car stopped, William quickly took out the keys of the car and he ran out of there running for his life. And of course, without the keys of the car, it's not going anywhere. So the kids also got out of the car and they started running as well. William took out his phone and then he called the cops. And just a few minutes after that, they arrived, and not long after that, Jaco and Alta were finally arrested. And once they were arrested, Jaco and Alta just confessed to the murder of Santa Pretorius. On the 14th of July, they had to appear in court and they were charged with murder, robbery with aggravating circumstances, as well as being in possession of an illegal gun and bullets. And they were also charged with theft. Jaco's parents didn't want him anywhere near them if he got bail. And the same goes for Alta as well, because none of her relatives would take her in once they knew what she had done. And so if they both got any bail, they wouldn't have anywhere to stay. So this is when the court decided to deny them bail. And since these two were still minors at that time, they were given the names of Adam and Eve so their identities could be protected. And these are the names that they were famously known as, hence the caption of this episode. They were then taken in for a psychiatric evaluation before their trial started in May of 2002. And when the trial started, they both pleaded guilty to all the charges that were laid against them. So this meant that their trial was just going to go ahead and jump ahead to the sentencing. And when their reports came back from their evaluations, it was discovered that Alta was a very narcissistic, manipulative, and very impulsive person. And it was also reported that her narcissism made it difficult for her to realize that when her mother was trying to separate her from Jaco, she was only doing it because she cared. Because in her mind, she only believed that her mother never loved her, that her mom never cared for her, and that's why she always stood in her way whenever she wanted to be with Jaco. It was all because of her narcissism. And it was also reported that Alta claimed that she never felt love, like I said, from her mother, but she only felt emotional burden. So clearly something was not okay with this girl. And then she brought up that claim again that her mother was threatening to send her to foster care if she never behaved well as a kid. The criminologist who testified on Alta's evaluation also testified on Jaco's evaluation as well. She said that Jaco was displaying some antisocial behavior as a result of the childhood that he had. And to show how dangerous these kids were considered, the criminologist said that if she was testifying in a case where the death penalty was still allowed in South Africa, she would have recommended, because of the nature of the crime and how vicious it was, and the fact that these kids were not showing any remorse for what they did, she would have recommended that they both get the death penalty. Just to give an idea of how dangerous and how impossible or close to impossible it was for these kids to ever change their ways. She also testified that these kids were very manipulative in a way that she wasn't very confident that they could ever be rehabilitated, and that if they could ever be seen as rehabilitated, they would just be masking that and disguising it only to make sure that they get an early release, only to go back to their old ways. But the two, again, they were found guilty of all the charges that were laid against them, and they were both sentenced to 20 years in prison in 2002. And it was said that Alta had to spend 15 years in prison before she could be considered eligible for early release. And she also had to prove that she was genuinely rehabilitated before she could ever be released early. And when their sentences were handed down, she started crying in shock. I don't know what the hell she was expecting, to be honest, because, hey, you just killed someone. But she was crying in shock, but her boyfriend was just sitting there, no reaction whatsoever. But yeah, guys, that was the chilling case of Jaco and Alta, aka Adam and Eve. I definitely want to know what you guys think about this one, and what you think about the fact that at the end of this year, in 2022, they both will have served their 20-year sentence, which means they will be out there. So I want to know what you think about that. And also, do you think that they could ever genuinely be reformed? Like, they could actually be good members of society? Or do you think that they will go back to their ways? I want to know what you think about this case. But for me, it was a wild one. But we're now at the end of the case. And again, thank you guys so much for your support. I appreciate you so much. And again, if you are new here, please be part of the family and subscribe to the channel for more episodes. And if you want to check out my previous episodes, I will have 2 of them right here for you on the screen. And you can check out what else I've talked about in the past. With that being said, I will see you guys next time. Take care of yourselves. Enjoy the rest of your day. Until next time. Cheers.